By the way, each one of you can get a free copy of one of the books I've written. That's part of the admission price. Free, F-R-E-E. A little bit of background about early life-saving service. There are 3 warrant officers right over there who served with my grandfather, who was a warrant officer in the Coast Guard. After being surfmen in the life-saving service, those 3 men there. Anyway, life-saving service got started on the Cape in 1872 when they built 9 stations from Monomoy to Race Point. Later on, they built a few more, so there were a total of 13 life-saving stations on the Cape until 1915. Then they became Coast Guard stations. So if you were a surfman in the life-saving service in 1914, you had a good shot at being promoted to be in the Coast Guard, and that's what my grandfather did. I never met him, but my grandmother lived to be 104, and in her 90s was telling me about life on the station, this station, that her husband was serving at. So she would go over every 7th week to help him cook. Are you folks in the back hearing me okay?
No.
No.
Sorry. I don't think that mic is loud enough at the moment.
I don't think so either, but we want to jack it up a little bit.
Do the volume.
I don't know how to do that.
Hello, hello, hello. Hello, hello.
There's some buttons over here.
Yeah, no, don't worry, I'm touching them. There we go. All right, try that.
Testing, ready? Is that better?
Yeah.
Better.
Better, but not perfect, right?
Yeah.
A little more? Okay. Now, which one of these advances it?
Down there, advances. There you go.
Okay, here we go. This is pretty self-explanatory, I think. This photo was taken right down the road in Stage Harbor, 1937. The boats were getting ready to be shipped to the Midwest, Coast Guard boats. The blue arrow points to the newly completed Coast Guard boathouse on Morris Island, or Stage Island. That will be coming back soon near the bridge. This is a clipping from the Cape Cod Standard Times, I think, from the Monomoy Point Station. It's Ed Tucker, Howard Madison, Al Long, Leo Kendrick, George Hallett, and surfman Albert DeCosta, who was not pictured in there, but was involved with Walter Love. He'll show up later. I knew some of these guys. The left clipping is from Woods Hole. They sent one of their boats, when it was on a Coast Guard trailer, to Boston en route to Cairo, Illinois. On the right clipping is the Monomoy Point surf boat, commanded by boatswain George Hallett, proceeding in the face of a stiff southeast storm from Fort Chatham, in other words, coming up from Monomoy Point, or was expected to arrive at 2 o'clock this morning. So they were moving these 26-foot boats in the dark in January, right like tonight. The Wood End picket boat was unable to leave port because of the storm. Wood End being in Provincetown. This is one of the Chatham trailers that they used to move these boats, and a little tractor that they towed the thing with. I don't know if you can make out all the words or not, but I'm curious to know who this kid is. And who's this kid? Probably one of the sons of a surfman or a Coast Guardsman. they're shown as they loaded a motor surfboat from the Old Harbor Station aboard a Chatham Station trailer, preparatory to the trip for the Ohio. Now, this is quite, I can't believe, I mean, I can believe it, but Monomoy Point Station, Old Harbor Station, and right up there, they had to go to Boston. And now, I presume that they went out around this way. It would be really difficult, it would be too tricky to go through the canal and stuff. But it's 40 miles from here to Provincetown. Yeah. And the boat has a 21-gallon fuel tank, which gave them 45 nautical mile range. So they must have had extra fuel somehow. I don't know how they did it. The picket boat is shown on the railway right there. But also these range markers were basically mile markers on the beach. Just nothing to do with this event, but just so you know. This is a 38-foot picket boat. They had one of these at Stage Harbor when in the 40s. I remember seeing it anchored out there. But they're apparently not seaworthy because they couldn't leave to go to Boston. Can you back? You can read that?
No.
No. You want me to read it to you?
Sure.
Okay. On the left column, a string of gondola cars loaded with 10 28-foot, 26-foot motor surfboats and 3 Pullman cars carrying 44 Coast Guard officers and men rode out of the South Station for a 30-hour dash to Cairo, Illinois, and the flood zone. Their departure ended a day and night of top-speed flood relief preparations. Throughout the night, while a chill rain fell, guardsmen and naval men swung the 25,000-pound boats onto hastily built cradles on the gondola cars. At Providence, center of another Coast Guard district, a similar scene was enacted as 5 boats swung aboard the cars. The Boston and Albany Railroad planned to form a single train of the 2 groups in Worcester. On the right column, each boat carried a 20-horsepower motor capable of driving at 8 knots. Each drew only 2 feet of water and all were self-bailing. In other words, if the water came in, it would go right out through the scupper. 5 portable radio sets were on board. The boats were gathered yesterday and last night from stations as far north as Hampton Beach, New Hampshire, and as far south as Narragansett, Rhode Island. The commanding Boston Coast Guard Division named Lieutenant Irwin B. Steele commander of the party. Shanley and other rescue parties would be formed from other New England stations and moved west tonight. This is January 25th. Not quite there yet. Despite the depletion of crews from stations all along the New England coast, the Coast Guard said that enough men were left to man these stations and should any emergency arise. Sure. Yesterday afternoon, motor surfboats from Cuttyhump and Gay Head left their ports to go to across the Sound to East Providence. Each of the 2 stations sent 4 men under a chief boatswain's mate to the gathering point where the men and equipment will be loaded aboard flat cars for the overland journey. I want you to notice the icicles hanging off the bottom of this boat. This is salt water. Freezes what, at 28 degrees? See, it must have been really brutal. Coast Guards are shown at the Boston Navy Yard loading small boats onto railroad cars for shipment to the flood area of the Midwest. The boats gathered from New England stations all are destined for shallow water rescue service. Edward Silva of Monomoy Station and Carl Newcomb, linesman for the district, returned late Friday night with a truck and boat trailer, having been gone since Wednesday. The linesmen were actually independent people. They were in the Coast Guard, but they didn't respond to anybody except their own line people. They could do what they wanted, basically. They reported that when they got to Boston, they were held there to help transport men and luggage from the boats to the trains. The equipment of the Rendell Construction Company, which had been building the new boathouse at Chatham, will be repaired on the beach here before being sent. I've never read anywhere else about who built that building, but now you know, Rendell Construction Company. Albert Long of Orleans Coast Guard Station went to send a message to his family in Chatham that there were 95 men and 40 boats on the train with him. This was sent from Cleveland, Ohio, on Wednesday. William Silva of the Orleans Station received word from Albert Long that the surf boats had been sent to Cairo, that he was with the picket boat in Evansville, Indiana. Howard Madison of the Monomoy Point Station sent word to his mother Friday that he was in El Dorado, Illinois, but that orders had been changed. He was going to Paducah, Kentucky. Hurry up and wait. Okay, this is kind of long, but it's the clippings from the Standard Times. Cape Cod Coast Guardsmen went from Boston to El Dorado, Illinois, arriving there January 29. Original orders directed them to Cairo, but they were unable to launch the boats. At El Dorado, an engine backed the train with flat cars into the water, and the boats were shoved off. They floated off. That night, the men slept in a drying room of a mine on a cement floor. The next day, they went down the river, leaving 2 men in a hospital. Then on to Golconda, Illinois, that night to sleep on the floor of a river dam house, or a dam river house, one or the other. They left 2 more there with the grip. There it's called River Fever, on down the river to Paducah, where the guards slept that night on a riverboat. Next day, they went to Cairo on the way to Wickliffe, Kentucky. There they stayed 6 nights, sleeping in a church with curved pews. They were fed in another church by the Red Cross with 2 meals a day. Making for cigarettes were provided. Okay. There too, they left 8 men in the hospital. The work at Wickliffe was varied. Most of the time, the men slept in their clothes and lived out of their pockets. Towel and soap in one, in another tobacco and cigarette papers, in another pocket, a rarely used comb and razor. These guys must have been pretty nasty after a while. On Sunday night, with 10 boats, the men went down the river to Hickman, Kentucky, then on to Osceola, Arkansas. After breakfast on the Coast Guard vessel Triton, they proceeded to Caruthersville, Missouri, sleeping on the engineering boat Captain Clark. They continued on to Barfield, Arkansas, leaving 5 boats, with 5 keeping on to Osceola. They spent a week there before moving on to Memphis, Tennessee, staying in the Hotel Gayoso. These guys must have been like a fish out of water, going that far down the river. I lived in Memphis for 3 years, and I can't imagine what it was like in late 30s living there. They didn't actually live there, but they lived probably on the boat. The Coast Guard cutter Triton, where they got some food and maybe slept on the ship. Okay, here is the Old Harbor boat. You can see over on the left the blue arrow pointing to says Old Harbor on it. That is pretty amazing. That here we are. As fresh leaks were found in the seawalls at Cairo, the Coast Guard did valiant work seeing to it that thousands were placed at points of safety outside the boot city of the state of Illinois. Look at the telephone on the pole on the right over there, how high the water is. There were at least 3 dogs on this boat. Oh, I see 4. Okay, anyway, whatever. They saved people and pets and whatever they could. These are Boston area Coast Guard boats. Point Allerton, Nahant, Gloucester, North Situate, and right at the back is Monomoy Point. And in the foreground, we don't know the names of the boats, but they must have been from the Cape. Here, these are at Cairo, Illinois. These are boats in New Jersey being loaded. I'm not sure about the boats in the foreground. Because it has the letter C on it, and then the one behind it says, looks like 7. That typically would be on a large Navy ship where they had these motor launches and stuff. I don't think those are Coast Guard boats, but I don't know. Anyway, they're being loaded along with the smaller boats. I don't have any pictures of the picket boats actually being used, so I don't know where they went. I keep looking at these pictures to see if I can see cans of fuel for these boats, because they have limited range. I don't know where they got the fuel. This boat is not very well kept, but it did float, so I guess. Radio reporters broadcasting during the 1937 Indiana flood. Cincinnati, late 1937. Late January, I'm sorry. This is where some of the men from the Cape stations were stationed for a while in Hickman. And the next slide shows them, somebody from New England building a fire, trying to keep hands from freezing. Members of New England unit build a fire to keep hands from freezing. Men are shown here behind section of the levee at Hickman, where they have been enforced idleness for days. Like I said, hurry up and wait. Saved from swirling waters, rescued at last from their flood-swept home in Lawrenceburg, several miles below Cincinnati. Members of one family are shown being carried to dry land by Coast Guardsmen. Everybody's wearing a hat. These next couple of pictures were sent to me by a friend in the Midwest, but I don't know where they were taken. You see in the foreground what I think they call punt, flat bottom skiffs, if you will. Not terribly seaworthy, but probably adequate. This is in Louisville. By the way, there was a floating lifesaving station in Louisville, Kentucky. Throughout the United States, there were 260 stations, lifesaving stations. Cape Cod had 13 of them, and Chatham had 4. The movie playing is The Fugitive Blonde. And this is from Google Street View a few years ago, when things had dried out. It was a big deal. You see in the background a motor lifeboat, motor surfboat, I mean, tied up at the pier there. St. Joseph, Michigan. The boats came from all over the country. This is local stuff. Miss Natalie Burris, West Chatham, received word from Walter Love, Monomoy Point Coast Guard, that he is in Evansville, where the train on which the Coast Guard were traveling was marooned. Supplies were brought by the Coast Guard. It is presumed that Captain Wright and men from the other Cape station would be close behind. Miss Burris later became Mrs. Walter Love, and she and her husband became Ryder family friends. Walter was in the Coast Guard later on, and he was an officer in charge of the Coast Guard buoy tender at Woods Hole, and later or earlier, was in Greenland when they were chasing German radio operators. Walter was a neat man. Just for relevance or reference. And this is a plan on how to build one of these things, sort of. But it doesn't show the fuel tank, but you can see the shallow draft, 2 feet of water. This is ideal for this kind of work. So, guess where the Old Harbor boat is now? At Old Harbor Station in Provincetown. You can see we have, I say we, Dave Ryder paid for this boat to be moved into the building. He didn't know it because he was deceased, but I used some of his money that he left us to pay $2,500 for the crane to put that boat in the building. I think he would be okay with that. This is the station on Morris Island back in the 30s. That boat wagon has big airplane tires and stuff. By the way, that station was just torn down. That building, I mean, was just torn down by the Fish and Wildlife Service. Coast Guardsmen from the Sandwich and Waterway Point Station load the motor surf boat on the wagon at the water's edge at Sandwich. I don't see any houses on the Sandwich Beach back then.
No.
Securely loaded on the wagon, the tractor is about to pull the surf boat up the beach. William Wolf of the 3rd District and Warrant Officer Ralph Rich of Sandwich stand inspecting the boat in the center foreground. I don't know what they were looking for, but that's the Monomoy Point boat. And this is a close-up of the trailer and the hitch. You could tow it from either end. When we got the boat, it was not painted like this, but I did some research and found the bottom was supposed to be painted with green bottom paint. But because we knew it was never gonna go into water, we bought a gallon of house paint. Nobody knows the difference. You can see in the center, I think there's a fuel tank, the little cap right there. Yeah. And up forward on the bow is a hatchet for cutting a line, I guess. But also you can see it has row locks on either side on the gunnels there. So you could row the boat if you had to, but I don't see the oars. And that odd looking elbow thing must have been the gear shift. Or maybe it's the throttle, I don't know. But when we put the boat, we did the work on the boat here at the Coast Guard station, and then the engine did run at the time, so it probably would still run. George Benson Nickerson, who had been at Nauset Station in 1935. He was entertaining, he happened to be there, officer in charge, when the head of the Treasury Department, George Morgenthau, showed up and they had a thunderstorm, and they sought refuge in the station, which was built in 1872. And they started throwing banana peels and sardine cans around, and the chief was offended, but he didn't know Morgenthau was his ultimate boss. So said, okay, so Morgenthau introduced himself, and he said, okay, let me show you around, to show you the deficiencies of this place. And so 2 months later, the engineers were there laying out the new station. So sometimes it pays to stir up trouble a little bit. Okay, men of the Chatham Station under George B. Nickerson journeyed from Cairo to Memphis, but spent most of the time in Hickman, Kentucky. Nickerson was officer in charge of 25 boats, all in readiness at all times to be sent where needed. He told of the attempts to Coast Guard to place dogs, mules, and chickens on rafts on which they could be floated to safety. Good food and proper sleep were unattainable until the Coast Guard cutter from the Gulf of Mexico arrived in Hickman. It was on this that the men were able to receive better food and some rest. reunited with relatives and friends at the Hyannis bus terminal. Remember that? Saturday night, 7 Lower Cape Cod spent the first night of the month in comfortable beds at home or in their respective stations. The contingent, composed of Chatham and One-Way Point members, arrived in Hyannis by bus from Middleborough, where they embarked from a Boston train on the last lap. On the Captain Ridge, the Sandwich Coast Guard reported the heaviest work was in Mounds and Mound City, both located about 8 miles north of Cairo. There were 1,500 refugees removed from Mound City one afternoon in an hour and a half. The next afternoon, an additional 800 were taken from Mound. This last paragraph is pretty interesting. Food was reported poor by these men. Their chief course of the daily menu consisted of peas, salt pork, and sauerkraut. Salt pork is considered the only type of meat in many localities, they said. Yeah. You know what a 7-course meal is in Memphis? I can tell you, a possum and a 6-pack. I spent 3 years there. Okay. I don't know who does that say? Sprague. Thanks to Wayne Love, son of Walter, who shared the 1930s clippings with me before he died. Wayne's mother, Natalie, must have saved the clippings into an album. Thanks to Google, Command Ring, and the internet, from which many photos were obtained, and thanks to eBay, where I found and purchased some of the better photos. Okay, this is going to be hard for you to accept. But you'll have to. Coming to Orleans, sorry Chatham, soon the Orleans Historical Society will start fundraising to build a permanent home for the famed motor lifeboat 36500. The boat has been well taken care of for over 40 years, but now it's time for it to be taken out of the water. The plan is to build the museum next to the Heard Chapel in Orleans, across the street from the Orleans Town Hall. You will see it through the windows as you drive by to Nauset Beach. And this is what SV Design of Chatham, the architect, and H2 Design team, they're from off Cape, but they have been working together. And there'll be 3 levels. You enter up on the upper right, go down the ramp, down the steps, and then you'll be at the waterline level, basically. And then you go down below some more steps to see the propeller and how the bottom looks, which you don't get to see now. So, that's it.
Richard, isn't the propeller on view at the lighthouse?
Yes, there is a propeller from the boat in front of the lighthouse. I can tell you how that got there.
Okay.
Donnie St. Pierre had some wealthy friends, he probably still does, when he ran the garage. And there was a guy, a wealthy man, who they had done some restoration work and they owed $15,000. So this guy knew about it. And he says, how much do you have to pay off? He said, $15,000. He says, I'll write you a check for 20. And Donnie couldn't wait to call us up and say, you can't believe what happened. He said, I got a check for $20,000 from this guy. And they had taken off this propeller because it was bent or worn or something. And they decided to mount it on a piece of wood and give it to him because he lived someplace with a nice view, I think on Morris Island or someplace, I don't know where he lived. So then he kept it for a few months, he turned it back in, he said, we don't want this, we think this should be shared with the public. So we need to mount it on a rock. So my friend Vern Hunt ran the memorial place over in Orleans, and we picked out a rock, a suitable rock. It was $1 a pound, $1,300 for the rock. And we mounted it on, I thought it would be stolen, but it's not, nobody's bothered it ever since it's been there. So that's the propeller story, okay? Yes.
Those boats that were used were surf boats. They were not originally designed to do river duty, I take it.
That's correct. They were designed they were motor surf boats. They were an upgrade from rowing surf boats. they call them pulling surf boats, which were
Were
really,
there any advantages or disadvantages to using a surf boat on a river?
I can't think of any, no.
They were what's available.
Yeah, there's no heat, obviously.
What is available on the river now?
Oh, they have,
How things change for supplies.
well, they have different size response boats, response boat, medium, they were the 45 footers that they have now in Chatham, two of them. Those are probably more than they need, because they draw too much water. But they have smaller boats for that kind of work. Coast Guard actually does work on tending buoys and day markers on the rivers, western rivers, like Iowa and stuff, way out there. The Coast Guard is there still. I saw another hand come up.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that historic weather event? And was it unusual for boats to be called from that far away to, create services for this event?
Apparently, they had done this 10 years before, 1927. There are pictures of the Coast Guard being all together in similar boats out in the same area. So I don't think it was unusual for them to do that. But they were perfect for the job, except you can't carry very many people. But you can get into places easy. Way in the back.
Yes, sir. I heard on the radio today, well, every day I learn something new, but this was something new. The caller asked why the Coast Guard used to be under the control of the Treasury Department. Does anyone here know the answer to that?
I do.
Well, you're the expert, so anyone else? Okay, I'll let you give the answer.
In 1790, when they got started in Massachusetts, they were designed to, it was called the Revenue Cutter Service.
Yes.
And they were enforcing the rules of importing goods and stuff. So that was under the Treasury Department, and they stayed that way until it became under the Homeland Security.
Right, they were meeting the ships as the ships came towards land to collect the tariff money.
Yes, but they were not combined. They were combined with the Revenue Cutter Service and the Lifesaving Service in 1915, January 28th, actually, day before my birthday. So it's easy to remember this stuff, you know. So Morgenthau was still the head of the Coast Guard when he came to Eastham, 1936. And that station was called a not a Duluth type, a Roosevelt type, Roosevelt era. There's quite a few of them around. You can recognize it. By the way, the Chatham station on Morris Island was the first one of 20-something built in the 19-teens. And those are called Chatham type. The old harbor is called Duluth type because the first one was built in Duluth, Minnesota. Who knew, right? There were 28 buildings like that in the United States, same design. So must be more questions. Yes,
You referred a number of times to picket boats. Why were they called that?
I have no idea. Probably from the Civil War, maybe, I don't know.
When they were standing guard against trespassers?
By the way, there were two floating life-saving stations in the country. The one in Louisville at the Ohio River, which my wife and I have been on, near it, the one replica. And there's one was stationed in Boston Harbor. Was anchored there in the summertime for rescue sailors who were racist and got in trouble. And also in World War II, it served as a stop point. Before you enter the harbor, you got to go to the clearance, and there were people running it. Yeah.
Richard, I'm from Orleans, so I got to be really careful in Chatham because we own the 36-500. A little story about the 36-500. She had been forgotten in the Cape Cod National Seashore.
Right.
And a photographer named Bill Quinn from Orleans found her and traded photographs for the National Park Service to get the boat.
Right.
And he brought it back to Orleans, to the Orleans Historical Society. And there have been three renovations or restorations of that boat. The was work done by Pease Brothers, back in the early seventies or eighties, as I remember. I was involved in the Community Preservation Committee, and we gave money to the Orleans Historical Society to do some additional work, that was done by Suzanne Leahy in Orleans.
Right.
And the interesting thing is we got a grant because she's on the National Register. And I went to a meeting in Boston at the Mass Historical Commission, and everybody there was talking about the buildings that they had got grants for. And I was there saying, well, we got a grant for a boat. And people couldn't believe that you could have a boat on the National Register. And now she's due for some more work. But the Orleans Historical Society has taken this as a very special project. And Richard showed you some quick pictures of what's going on. They need to raise a lot of money to make this happen, and you'll hear about it. And she's an icon, and she needs to be preserved and saved. And if you think about it and have a chance, make a donation, because she's a very special thing. I just, one other thing, Richard, I gotta say, I got a call from Richard many years ago. He said, hey, Alan, I gotta take the 36,500 from Meeting House Pond down to the Chatham Fish Pier. And all the buoys have been taken in, you know something about it, could you lead me down? So we went down, then he said, hey, by the way, next weekend, we're gonna bring Santa Claus into the Fish Pier. Would you like to come along? So my wife and I and Richard,
And
Pat was there too.
Yeah.
And somebody from the Coast Guard fundraising group was there, and we brought in Santa Claus. That was sort of a special day.
Well, let me tell you, go back a little bit to 1973, when I was just graduating from Cornell. I was aware that the boat was sitting at the Park Service. I wrote a letter to the Park Service asking them what they were going to do with this boat. 1973, way before Bill Quinn.
Yeah.
They said we're going to restore it when time and funds permitted. She laid outside for 13 years. I have pictures of that. That I can show you in a different show if you want to see it. But anyway, they called, Bill Quinn was a man of conscience. He called Chatham Historical Society, right here, these folks. Joe Nickerson, you know, remember Joe Nickerson? He said, we don't want no damn boat. They had a chance to take it. They blew it. Just like, so, you know, it wound up, and so Bill Quinn, he traded some aerial photos with the Park Service. There was no money involved, but the money came later when folks like Donnie C. Pierre got money for stuff. So yeah, I'm glad to know that some Orleans people who have influence are okay with this, like yourself. Yes, ma'am.
Following along the lines of Just Take It, I was the little girl growing up here in Chatham in the early 60s and couldn't play Little League baseball as desperately as I wanted to be on the team. But I do know what a Louisville Slugger is. And I'm wondering if any of the rescue guys, those bats were floating in the river, did anybody come home with a baseball bat?
I don't know. I think they were just glad to get home. I mean, the water was totally contaminated. That's why they all got sick, but not all of them.
But I think the souvenir from Louisville would be a...
I never put that together. I played Little League, but I don't know what kind of bat we had.
I see a lot of the ladies nodding their heads, so I'm glad there's some camaraderie of other frustrated Little Leaguers.
How long did the flood last?
I don't know how long the flood lasted.
Because it took them forever to get the boats out there and organized. It
Well,
must
yeah,
have been
they were
months.
gone for a month, so it must have been
Yeah.
most of that time. I don't know. Maybe you can go home and Google that. So, oh yes.
Was the great hurricane in 38 that hit the East Coast? Was that
Mhm.
38? And so, did that, what kind of effect did that have in the local area?
I have a treatise written by somebody who had documented all the damage to the Coast Guard stations in 38. Terry Ryder, anybody know Terry Ryder? Ryder and Wilcox? His mother was, let's see, how does this go? George Gustavus was Terry's grandfather. George Gustavus was the lighthouse keeper in Rhode Island, and his son and his wife were lost in the 38 hurricane. George Gustavus came to Chatham in 1938 and was the last civilian keeper of the lighthouse. Became Coast Guard in 39. So there was a lot of damage. 1944 hurricane, I remember this right down the road here was flooded, and there was a lot of damage. The building that used to be at the Marine Railway was flattened, and a lot of trees were down in downtown Chatham, but they brought in German prisoners from Camp Edwards, Otis, to cut the trees up. They were well fed, they didn't have to fight or to shoot anybody, right? They were happy to come here to cut trees because most of the Chatham men were gone, in the war. So I know that's more than what you want to know, but that's generally what I do.
Thank you.
So have you been to the Marconi Maritime Museum? That's an interesting place. When I first went in there, my brother was involved with the restoration, and the name tags on the doors of the hotel, they call it, the big building, the brick at the higher level, the names of the guy who was living in the room was still there. They had not done anything to the building. It's pretty impressive what they accomplished. Probably with some community preservation funds.
Yeah.
So where do you guys go now? Go to eat someplace? Well, thank you for coming, and this has been fun for me, and I hope informative for you. I knew some of these people.